Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are glad to have you at this week's History is Lunch. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums, and we're glad to have you here in our home, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. If you'll go ahead and take a moment and silence your cell phones or place those on Do Not Disturb. And then if you're watching online, we're glad to have you here today. Just as a reminder for both everybody online on Facebook and YouTube, as well as in the room, that our previous programs are available on both of those platforms for viewing. So if you missed one, or you have somebody who couldn't be in the room today, you can send them that link and they can be able to watch and participate in our program here today. But as we kick off a new school year, I do want to take a moment just to share a little bit about our two Mississippi Museums membership program and how it supports students across our state. Your contributions help ensure that student groups from Tupelo to Moss Point, from Meridian to Vicksburg, can experience these museums with free admission, lunch, and transportation. Governor William Winter once called these museums the state's largest classroom, and we take that mission very seriously here at the two Mississippi Museums, because we believe our stories are a strength, and we want to make sure that every Mississippi student has the opportunity to see these spaces, to experience these stories, to know their stories many times before they graduate. And so I just want to thank you, everybody that has contributed to make that impact. If you haven't become a member of the two Mississippi Museums or the Foundation of Mississippi History, you can do that when you exit this space and you head back into the lobby at the front desk. They can sign you up for that membership, and it supports that incredible work to make sure almost 20,000 Mississippi students make it through this museum each calendar year. And so that's a program we're very thankful for, and we're glad to have your support. But today we are delighted to host an incredible conversation on 4 decades of writing and 26 works of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry that established Ellen Gilchrist as one of the South's most endearing authors. At this time, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. Today we have Tracy Carr, who is the editor of today's featured work, Conversations with Ellen Gilchrist, which is available for purchase after the program. Lucious Lampton, chief editor of the Journal of Mississippi History, the Journal of Mississippi State Medical Association. My apologies there. And board vice president here at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Holly Lange, who's the co-founder of the Mississippi Book Festival, and Scott Anderson, the author of The Hard Times and editor of the literary journal China Grove, alongside Dr. Lampton. So please give our incredible panel a warm welcome as they make their way to the stage.
My clicker. Sorry. There's so many people here. I'm so happy to see, I have to say. All you book festival people, thank you very much for being here. And old friends. Okay, we'll get started. First, thanks to everyone for coming out, and all of you Facebook people watching from home. And thanks especially to my co-presenters who really did all the work. They're the ones that did the interviews. I just put them together. So if you're not super familiar with the writer Ellen Gilchrist, I'm going to give just a really brief overview of her life and work. And because they are so bound together, all of the details of her biography are really important to understand her work because she drew so heavily from it. Okay, there's our little intro. Okay, she was born February 20th, 1935 in Vicksburg. At the time, her father was a baseball player, and they were living in Issaquena County at her mother's family's plantation. Her dad then joined the Army Corps of Engineers, and so they moved around a lot. They lived in Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana, and she ended up graduating from high school at Southern Seminary and Junior College in Buena Vista, Virginia. So pause to look at this center photo. She's the one with the SIG in her hand. This is her high school graduation. She's the sassy one with her leg propped up. Gotta love that. And this first picture is her and her mother. And just have to say, I swiped the second and third photos from her open Facebook page. So if you also want to see a lot of photos, you can go look there. Okay, so she graduates from high school, and then her college career begins in a whirlwind. She goes to Vanderbilt. She transfers to Alabama, Roll Tide. And then she goes to Auburn. And then she elopes, leaves college, elopes with Marshall Walker. They have 2 kids. They get a divorce. She marries another guy who was a judge, divorces him, remarries Marshall Walker, has another child, divorces him. So if you're familiar with her work, and this sounds an awful lot like Rhoda, the character Rhoda Manning, there's a reason for that. So after this second divorce, she moves to Jackson, where her parents lived, and she enrolls at Millsaps and takes a class with Eudora Welty. So the stars really aligned. The one semester Miss Welty taught at Millsaps is the one semester, or the first semester, Ellen Gilchrist enrolls. So that was kismet. Then she marries another man and moves to New Orleans. So that kind of gets you caught up on the backstory. So I want to play a video. This is from Mississippi Public Broadcasting had a show called Postscripts, and this 3-minute clip is available on YouTube. So let's.
When I was when I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, I went to the library every Saturday of my life. Most of the things that I did with other people. I mean, I like to have 2 or 3 other people around. My mother let me have people spend the night with me all the time, and I always had 1 or 2 close friends, and somebody spent the night with me every night. My brother would be upstairs having 4 people spend the night with him. But there was this lonely thing that I did all my life, and that was read. But my mother's a big reader, and one of my grandmothers, I had people I could discuss books with, and I always had secret relationships with English teachers in that I would stay after class and talk to them. I read poetry a lot. Oh, I remember. I'd been reading a sad poem with a Greek name about how a poet, probably a 17th century poet, had lost his best friend. And instead of going to the funeral, he'd gone off to the woods to have a private, whatever this big Greek word was, that meant, that he would stay there. I was in love with a boy that was a lot older than I was, and I thought he was going to die of cancer. And I must have been thinking about that. I'd been out there, with my same age boyfriends. So I went hiking off into the woods, and the sun was going down, and it was a cold, dark, late fall day. And finally, I went up over the rise of a hill, and I was sitting up on top of that hill saying, I probably had the book of poetry with me too, reading the book of poetry to myself and imagining the death of this person, who's very healthy, 54-year-old at the moment, and did not, thank God, die of cancer or anything else. And then I probably, and I remember that I did, wrote poems all afternoon. I wrote on one. I know it was a lot of writing. And in that writing, I was a person grieving over the death of a person. There'd been no deaths in my family except, very old people that was not greatly saddened by. And then when I was satisfied with that and the sun was almost down or completely down, I'd be walking back home in a strange sort of state. And by the time I got to my yard, I'd be myself again, and I'd go in the house and go in the kitchen. Everybody'd say, why are you late to dinner, and why weren't you here, and where have you been? And then I'd eat about 15 pieces of cinnamon toast and drink a whole lot of milk, and I'd be a child again. But I think that that's true of my writing then, and it's true of it now. When I write, I get up out of bed and I make some coffee and all this, and I'm my nice, normal self. And if my grandchild's been spending the night, I take him home. And then I go into the room where I work, and I'm someone else.
Okay, so if if you've never heard her talk before, that was a treat. Not just the content, but the style. She's thinking about something, she switches to this, and she's telling a story, and it's all over the place. So you can imagine how fun this was to transcribe. How are all of those little redirections included? Should I put some in? That was really a fun challenge. Okay, so when we left off on her biographical story, she had married Freddie Coleman and moved to New Orleans. So at some point, her friend Jim Whitehead, who was who had started the creative writing program at the University of Arkansas, encouraged her to come to Fayetteville. He said, "You need to be in a community of writers." And so she did. She enrolled. There's a lot of differing data on how long she stayed. I've heard 2 months. I've seen that she got an MFA. I don't know which one is true. But so she fell in with that community that Jim Whitehead encouraged her to find. And that led to her first book being published, The Land Surveyor's Daughter, published by Lost Roads Press in 1979. And if you're not familiar with Lost Roads Press, like I was not before I started this project, the poet Frank Stanford was one of the people that she became friends with in Fayetteville and was a part of that community with. He was this very talented, very troubled poet. He actually died by suicide in 1978, so he never saw this published. He also wanted it to be called, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, it had a totally different title that he was fighting her on, but obviously she won because he couldn't argue with her. Anyway, if this is interesting to you, there is a lot more about this and about Ellen's role in Frank's life in The Life and Poetry of Frank Stanford, this amazing biography that came out a couple of years ago. So, all right, so The Land Surveyor's Daughter is published, which then leads the University of Arkansas Press to publish her first book of short stories, In the Land of Dreamy Dreams. That for a university press, it goes huge. They are not expecting this huge reaction to a university press book. That happened in 1981. That led to her getting a contract with Little Brown and for a book of short stories and a novel. And so that was The Annunciation, which came out in 1983, and Victory Over Japan in 1984, which was the turning point for her life completely changing. Just wanted to point out too, the covers of In the Land of Dreamy Dreams, Victory Over Japan, Drunk with Love. I'm not sure about the Anna papers, but those were all done by an artist named Jenny Crouch Stanford, who was married to Frank Stanford and was a part of that creative community in Fayetteville. And I've always loved those. So reading about who that person was a real treat. Let's see. Okay, so then she has essay collections. Falling Through Space is a collection of her commentaries that appeared on Morning Edition when Morning Edition was new, and they were looking for a little. She claims she was the first correspondent on NPR. I am not exactly sure that is accurate, but she was a correspondent on NPR. So we'll give her that. Okay, so all in all, that's a very cute picture. I can't remember, probably from her Facebook page. 2 books of poetry, 14 books of short stories, 7 novels, and 3 essay collections. And all of this, she was lauded in many ways. She received a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship Grant in 1979. She won the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award for Literature 3 times. And when I said Victory Over Japan changed her life, she won the National Book Award for Fiction in 1984. And at that, this is a photo of her winning the award. She had this really weird speech, and It's probably the weirdest thing I've ever heard someone say at, receiving an award. She says, hey, I guess she thanks everyone, and then it's awkward silence. And she says, I brought my Lionel Richie tape if anyone wants to listen to it.
She was so nervous that that's what she had on her head. She wasn't listening to the proceedings.
Well, the thing is, the Lionel Richie moment in the audience was, his name escapes me, sorry, the morning edition person from NPR. And he was like, Bob Edwards, yes. So he's like, wow, off the cuff. So weird and witty. Do you want a job? And that's how that came about. So we all need to embrace our Lionel Richie moments and say weird things all the time. Okay. All right, so this is also a photo from the National Book Award, and you can't really tell in this picture, but she's wearing a red velvet suit, which I just think is awesome. And I wouldn't have known that except the same article that recorded the Lionel Richie thing. It was in People magazine, which, by the way, wanted $6,000 to reprint it, and that's why it's not in the book. But it says that she's wearing this ruby red velvet suit and looks great in it. But anyway, just a note. So the book, this was published last year by the University Press of Mississippi. There are 18 interviews over a 40-year period. They came from videos, from radio interviews. There were print interviews, there were conference proceedings, there were book festival videos that I watched. And interviews are just such an interesting way of getting to know a writer's work and their life, especially a writer who drew so much on her life. So when she's talking about growing up, the summers on the plantation in Issaquena County, you're like, oh, I remember that detail from that story about Rhoda. That's right. So it was a real treat to read and transcribe all of these interviews. So speaking of interviews, let's get to some of the folks that talked to her. We're going to start with Luke and Scott. Their interview was called "The Last Southern Writer?" And it appeared in the first issue of China Grove, which is y'all's literary magazine. So first, tell us how that interview came about. Like, how did it start? And use your mics, please. Sorry.
Hello. I got to know Ellen. I had a quail hunting operation. I took people on guided quail hunts, and my wife bought me a book called "I Wrote a Man and Go Hunting with My Daddy," and that was my first exposure to Ellen Gilchrist. And so then I enjoyed the book, so I bought everything I could get my hands on because I'm an obsessive reader. And I had pretty much read everything she had done. And Luke and I were going to start this literary enterprise. And so I thought, well, this is a really good Southern writer. This is like a really tremendous asset to the state. And truly, I thought she was the last Southern writer because we had lost our regional identity. We had a McDonald's on every corner. We had Walmarts. We had, I guess we had some unique grocery stores, but really everybody had the same social environment. I thought that was washing out what geographic identity meant. And so that was the fundamental reason I thought we needed to interview her, because she stayed true to that. And pretty much Luke could see that that was the thing to do. And so we did it. I will tell you one funny story about this. When you read our interview, it sounds as though I know everything that happened in the room. The problem was the night before we went down there to do that, my friend, who's a plastic surgeon, did a blepharoplasty on me. And I said, can I go do this interview? He's like, yeah, sure. So I drove down, and Luke was going to drive me. So we go down, and we had arranged a 1-hour interview in a public restaurant to eat lunch and talk. And so that's what we intended to do. Well, we walk in, and Ellen sees my eyes in my face, and she's like, we have to go back to my house. We're going to put some frozen peas on your eyes. I spent the entire interview on a little day bed to put on the floor. And I laid on that with frozen peas on my eyes. And Luke had the foresight to video the interview. And so basically I transcribed it from the video. But I'm going to let Luke talk a little bit.
Well, he would rise like Lazarus whenever there came to be something he wanted to comment on. And I loved how you brought in the lines from Red that she was so familiar with about Rothko, and that was lovely.
We had spoken quite a bit on the phone before we ever decided to do the interview, because she wasn't going to give us an interview if she didn't know us. And she kind of, you had to set the tone. She had to believe in who you were and what you were trying to do. And so that's why we had spent so much time talking about things like Red.
One thing about her was Scott and I had seen her, and her body of work really makes her a woman of letters. And we were thinking sort of how Robert Penn Warren is considered a man of letters. And some of the old fugitive poets had such a breadth of ability. They were called, men of letters. And we were approaching her with her skill, and from everything from morning edition and the journal writing to poetry to fiction to nonfiction. She could do anything with a great force of intellect and also a great sense of humor. And but what's interesting is when we asked her, did she agree with that? She liked that comparison, but she said, I'm really a poet. And I think her entire writing career, if you look at what she's about, she's a poet and she said that what she figured out to be successful as a poet was she needed to hide the poems in her fiction. And so a lot of what she's doing in her fiction is hiding her poems. And she said she had a friend at the University of Arkansas that had encouraged her, well, just figure out a way to get your poetry in there. So as she was trying to hide her poems, she initially would actually have characters recite her poems and recite various poems within her fiction. And she thought that was the way to do it. But then she figured out that the poetry, you include the poetry itself in the words of the fiction, and it's how you write the fiction. And but I think that's very important, that she always considered herself a poet. The other thing that's interesting about her is she was a very lovely woman, very attractive woman. And she cared about how she looked. And she would not let us take a photograph of her to include. She said, I'll supply you with a photograph. Scott, what did you think about that? And we were fine with that.
Well, I mean, these were photographs, candids in some stage that her daughter-in-law had taken over, and they were very good photographs. And I didn't have any problem using them, and I'm not a good photographer, so it wasn't a question, oh, we should take these pictures. No, we'll use your pictures. We're fine with it.
But she didn't like if she did an interview with people and they took a photograph, she was never satisfied with them.
Yeah.
So she would supply her own photographs of herself.
And I'm going to tell you a secret that nobody knows, both about me and Ellen. I nominated her for the Nobel Prize in Literature, and I was able to nominate for the Nobel Prize because I was a fellow of the American College of Radiology, so I could nominate physics papers and medical papers and stuff. But I chose to make a nomination in literature, so I had to go find the chairman of a department who would second that nomination. And she made it to the finals, and she lost out to a French author who wrote his memoirs in the Second World War. And the French judge who was on the panel had justified the selection of the French candidate by saying she had support from educational institutions in the United States. He had to work as a dishwasher and a cab driver, and so he deserves the Nobel Prize in Literature, which I thought was crap.
What year was this that you nominated her?
It was 2 years after the interview, so
Okay, so
2015.
okay.
But that was one of those things that I thought she deserved that recognition, and I went to a good deal of trouble to make it happen.
That is a fun fact. That is not included in the interview, nor the P's are not mentioned.
She never knew.
either. Oh, she
No.
never knew?
No, I never told her.
Ooh, I love a secret.
The entire time we were doing the interview, she had a volume of Rilke in her hands, and she was fluttering it with her hands like this. And in the background of the interview, you can hear just the noise of the pages ruffling together. And we talked about Rilke, and she really loved to read poetry. And she said when she started as a poet, you know, she actually said Horace, Edna St. Vincent Millay was who inspired me. I like Edna St. Vincent Millay, but she had kind of grown beyond her. But she says, you know, Edna St. Vincent Millay was very much inspired by Shakespeare. And she said, Shakespeare has played a critical part in my existence. And she said, when I go to events, she said, when I go to a funeral, I think she had gone to her cousin's monk's funeral, and she recited in our interview an extended passage from The Tempest, and that she thought of at that funeral. But she was very interested in Shakespeare, and she thought that Shakespeare had the foundations of literature and poetry, and was a resource that writers need to be going to.
I was going to ask y'all about when she recites, I mean, it's not 2 lines. It's like 10 or 12 lines of from The Tempest. I'm not sure I've ever been in the room with someone who spontaneously started quoting Shakespeare at length. Was it shock? What was going through your minds when she was just like, yes, I went to a funeral and this is what I thought, and then just, delivers a soliloquy?
She did great at it, but you got to remember that she had that Sunday group while she was in Arkansas that they met every Sunday, and they read Shakespeare to one another, and they would each be responsible for a certain thing. And it's funny because that's one of the things she and I had in common. My wife, Charlene, and I used to drive all over the country when I was in the Navy, and we had the Globe volume of Shakespeare that we kept in the car with us, and whoever was driving was the audience, and whoever was the passenger was the actor. And so we drove all around the country reading Shakespeare to each other, but Ellen and her friends read Shakespeare to each other on Sundays.
She mentions that in various interviews. I don't know how long it went on, but long enough that several interviews she refers to her Shakespeare group. There's one, I think, where she's sort of lamenting that young people don't read Shakespeare and they should come to her group. They would be converted if she went there. I mean, if they came to that. Was there anything that you afterwards you were like, oh, I should have asked that you feel like you wanted to know and maybe forgot to ask, or it came to you later?
Well, for me, I stayed in contact with her for a very long time afterward until her death. And I always felt we would come back to it. I think that was our overall.
She maintained a relationship with us for years after that. We went out to eat with her multiple times. She'd come into town and we'd visit with her. I mean, that's interesting that she would establish, but she decided she liked Scott and me, and she, but that's the kind of person she was. And it was just a lovely person. And I do love one of the powerful things that she talks about, and she wrote about it in one of her autobiographical essays about meeting Eudora Welty, or she had known her, but But when she came out of the Carnegie Library with her three children, three redheaded children, sturdy, bustling children, and Eudora walked up and she said, "Here are my three children, Eudora. I want you to meet them." And she was just exasperated and tired. And Eudora says, "You have three children. Why do you need to write?"
Right.
And that speaks not only to, but it speaks also to Eudora's great sense of understanding. Eudora, one of her great regrets in her whole life is that she didn't have a family of children of her own. And, those that know her, she wanted to get married and she wanted to have children. And she loved her nieces extraordinarily closely. And family was very, very important to Eudora Welty. And when she looked at Ellen Gilchrist, Ellen had everything that she didn't have. Why would you be aspiring, to be a writer when you have three children that you can love and care for?
I'd like to read from that little part that she quotes from. So she comes out of the library and Eudora says, "Oh my, are they yours? Do they belong to you?" "They're mine," I said. "Aren't they funny? Why would you ever need anything else?" she said. "Why would you need to be a writer?" It comes across as wistful, when in that.
And I think, Luke, you knew both of them quite well. And I think there is a commonality in there, and they both had a gentility, a grace, and a welcoming nature that encouraged you to want to be a writer.
And they both celebrated the lives they had, and when but I do think you have a scene where Ellen is looking at Eudora, and Eudora's everything she wants to be, and her greatest hero. And Eudora's looking at Ellen and saying, what a lovely blessing she has in those three children.
It's interesting, y'all talked to her and she gave this interview. She was almost 80. In her younger interviews, she at first was not as respectful, you could say, about Miss Welty. There's one, and I don't remember which one, where she says something like, "Oh, she was just an old lady. She didn't teach us anything," something like that. But I think what she meant was Eudora was a writer, and teaching someone how to write is different than being a good writer, which is, I think, the spirit of what she meant. But it comes across as very flippant, like, that old lady didn't know anything, which was kind of funny.
I think in the interview, she said that Eudora brought her textbook from the University of Wisconsin in the 1930s. Yeah. And that was the text that she brought. And it was a collection of short stories and wonderful fiction. But it was actually Eudora's text from when she went to Wisconsin in the 1930s.
Why change it if it's good? I want to switch. We're going to come back to y'all, but I want to switch and talk about Holly. Hello, Holly. You've been down there silent the whole time. Talk about Holly's interview with Ellen at the 2022 Mississippi Book Festival. And so, Scott and Luke, even though we don't know about the P's on the I's until now, anything could have happened. They were at her house, it was a very intimate setting. And so maybe the conversation could have, they're quoting Shakespeare, and Scott pulls a book out of his briefcase and starts reading stuff. But Holly, yours is a lot. First of all, it's public, it was
live.
It's live.
Mm-hmm.
There's an audience, and not just the audience there, it was recorded for,
all of eternity,
which thankfully it was, because that's why it's in the book. So tell us, how do you prep for this experience?
Truly, I did not. I'll be very honest with you. I met Ellen probably in 1987. Can you hear me? Am I working?
Yes.
1987 in Austin, Texas. She was, she was visiting a friend's parents. And I walked in and I saw truly what I thought was the sexiest middle-aged woman I've ever seen in my entire life. And she was with Shelby Foote. I mean, it was just stacked. And I thought, well, this is great. And I'm sorry you didn't show it. There's another book called I Cannot Get You Close Enough. And it's a photograph, not a painting of a woman. And my twin sister ended up connecting with Ellen and then becoming the babysitter of the woman in the photograph of the book, just so we're all connected here. And then randomly, I picked this girl's name off a list named Whitney to babysit for my kids and she was at Millsaps College. And I came home from dinner with my husband and Whitney looked at me and she said, you know, Ellen's my aunt. And my husband will swear to you, it's the only time he's ever seen me truly speechless. So when we started the book festival, Jerry Nash, who is not here, said, we need these people and these people. And I said, y'all, we need some star power. We need Ellen Gilchrist. We need John Grisham. I mean, it was kind of like in that order. And so I texted Whitney and said, will you ask Ellen to be the book festival? And 10 minutes later, she said, sure, she's in. So I got to know Ellen better, sort of like Scott and Luke, in that you just sort of, you get to know someone, you develop sort of a rapport. One of the things I wanted to say about Ellen and Eudora, there are a couple of things, but one, their voices, their inflection, their Southern drawl was so almost comforting. I mean, it was just they were very approachable, normal, you know, there was nothing affected about Ellen. The scary part to me about Ellen was you just really never knew what was going to come out of her mouth. I mean, it was just a roll of the dice. So to answer your question, I did not prep for the interview. I mean, I have read all of her books. We've had conversations. After the first book festival, she sent me a poem with a flower she had drawn. And it's, I mean, I've saved everything she's ever written me in her voicemail. She left me 3 or 4 voicemails. And for those of you who don't do this, big pro tip, save them. I uploaded them to my Dropbox. So I have her voice for all, and seeing that video made me very sad, hearing her voice again. It was good to see her. So her son, Pierre, was at the book festival and he pulled me aside before the interview and he said, don't ask her about Trump. Don't get her going. And I was like, is she pro? And he was like, just don't ask. And I was like, all right, that's cool. And so I thought Welty would be the easiest topic. And in that interview, you can see it. She starts to go negative on Eudora Welty. And I was like, well, this is bad. This is very, very bad. We have to divert to something else. So I felt like do you see the expression on my face? I feel like the entire time I was like, I don't know what's going to happen next. And we got through it in approximately an hour. She was thrilled. She thought she was the star of the show. And I hate to keep leapfrogging, but at her first appearance at the Mississippi Book Festival, our first year, we had we thought was this cool Mississippi Stars panel. And Eudora was on it with Greg Iles and I think Richard Ford, I can't quite remember that, and Julia Reed and somebody else. And after the panel, they were in Galloway and it was packed. And after it was over, I didn't stay for the entire thing. I had to go somewhere else. But I saw Julia Reed afterwards and I said, how'd it go? She said, it was great, but Ellen talked the entire damn time. Nobody else could get a word in. And to out-talk Richard Ford and Julia Reed and Greg Iles is a pretty good accomplishment. So, you know, she was just it was just like honestly sitting there talking to my mother. I mean, you know, what do you want to talk about and where do we want this to go? I did ask her in that interview if she was Rhoda Manning. I remember when I first read, I guess it was Victory Over Japan, where Phelan Manning appears, Rhoda's father. And I remember reading that at the time when I was in college, and I thought, I want to know a man like Phelan Manning. He sounds all right to me. And so prepping for that, we talked about Phelan, we talked about Rhoda, but she never answers the question. She never says, I was Rhoda Manning. She says, well, I have some memories. I've given her some of my identity. But she won't just say it. So, you know, she was just, you know, she really was a poet, no doubt about it. And I think she was a writer beyond that. But her conversations flowed like poetry. I mean, it was like, you know, just little haikus every now and then. You just never knew what you were going to get.
Yeah, she, throughout the book, there's almost a frustration that she's not known as a poet. Like that's her identity. And so all this other stuff, these short stories, the novels, she really hated novels, by the way. There's an interview with 2 professors, and she rails against it. She was like, "It's a dinosaur. It should die." But then there's another interview where she talks about one of her friends was saying, "Oh, you need to write another novel," and she's like, "Why? Why do you want a novel? Why isn't a short story good enough for you?" And she was like, "Well, I want to, read it several nights in a row. I want to get in bed and cuddle up with it." And she was like, "Oh my gosh, that's literally the best reason I've ever heard for writing a novel."
But she did love a short story. I mean, the short story was absolutely the best thing I think she did.
Yes, but I think it's that poet's precision and compression that makes her, I think we can all say that she's a better short story writer than a novelist, perhaps. I mean, I love the novels, not all of them, but just being honest. But the short story, that's what she's known for,
Her short story, Rich, is one of the most
Oh my
beautiful
gosh.
short stories ever
Yeah.
written. And it's filled with, there's Gothic beauty and violence and humor all in one place. And it's one of our earliest short
It was
stories.
the first short story.
Say the title again.
Rich.
Rich. I think someone didn't hear that.
Rich.
Land of
No,
Dreamy
it's
Dreams.
actually, it's
Yeah.
the first story in the Land of Dreamy Dreams. It's the first story she wrote. And Jim Whitehead, again, it challenged her to write one. And she was like, "Okay, fine, I will." And he had told her that there has to be, I don't know, like something, a surprise in it or a twist. And the twist is huge in Rich. And there is violence, and it is very violent to the extent that she did not include it in further collections of her short stories because she didn't want her grandchildren to read it.
But it drips with the social structure of New Orleans.
Yes.
And the culture of New Orleans and in the South. And she had a friend whose husband had committed suicide. And before he committed suicide, he killed his pedigreed Labrador Retriever. And that worked its way
Spoiler
in
to the
this.
story, by the way.
And sorry, I spoiled it. One comment you had made though earlier was that she had said that she wasn't her main character, but she gave her main character her childhood memories.
Yes. So throughout all of the interviews, it's not hard to connect her life story to that of Rhoda. And so she's asked repeatedly throughout the years about the autobiographical nature. And she comes up with this answer that is really, I think, brilliant. She says, I just gave her all my childhood memories. Yeah, that's autobiographical. But she says it in a way that's like, oh, okay. Yeah, it's not based on you, but she has all your memories. Got it. Which is a great way of saying that.
There was one character, Scott, that she told you.
I'm sorry, when she switched, because Rhoda wasn't around anymore, because he was dead, and she became Louise Hand.
That was in The Dangerous Age.
Right, and she just flat out admitted to me, yes, I'm Louise Hand. And I caught it because her middle name was Louise. And I knew she would give the character that was her own name.
Holly, so you knew what you were dealing with. You knew this was not going to be a ask question, get answer kind of interview. So was there any struggle with like reining her in or keeping her on topic, or were you just like, let's go, girl?
Oh no, yeah, we had several conversations. We were talking about this earlier. When you called Ellen, you either got her answering machine, not voicemail, but a real answering machine, or she'd answer the phone and instantly if she liked you, she would talk to you. And if she didn't like you, she was running out the door. So when we first got to know each other, there were a couple of running out the doors, and we kind of pre-gamed the first interview and then this one. And she just finally said, we're just going to go with it. And I said, okay, that's great. And there are moments in the video you'll see where she literally looks off to the left and kind of drifts off in thought unrelated to anything that we were talking about in the room. And there are a couple of awkward seconds where I'm like, do I pull her back in or do I let her go? Because if I pull her back in and she's not ready, she would have said so. And it would have been a very embarrassing, awkward moment in my life to have made Ellen Gilchrist mad. But it worked out fine. And I just said, okay, Ellen, let's talk about such and such. And she would come on back and switch gears. She was really just the loveliest, easiest person. It just somewhat erratic, much like many authors. But I will say this, the one thing I know to be true about Ellen is more than anything, she did love being a mother and she did love her family. Before anything else, that was most important to her. And when she left Arkansas, I wish there was did we talk about that? I think we did. If anybody really wants to hear a funny story, she does talk about how she left Arkansas.
Oh yeah, that goes on. It goes on for a good long while.
She's a little unhappy about leaving Arkansas.
Yeah.
But she moved back to the coast because she wanted to be the central character of her children and her grandchildren and her nieces and nephews' lives. And so she bought a condo and they bought the one next door. So no one had to stay with her, but they could come and stay next door all the time. And I think most of her grandchildren, or 3 or 4 of them at some point, lived with her for an extended period of time.
Was it in your interview or another? She talks about Donna's School of Dance. Was that in yours?
I don't think that was mine.
Okay. Well, she talks about, the great love of her life is her children and grandchildren, and how she went to the coast and she would, ferry the children around, and they all had to go to Donna's School of Dance. And Donna's School of Dance. There's a whole long thing about the importance of, oh my gosh, you have to get in to Donna's School of Dance, and how she'd try to peer over the wall to watch the dancing. But yes, it's clear through her talking about her family and also in her work how much family meant to her. In both of y'all's interviews, and we can see it on Holly since that one is recorded, but it's very clear that she is loving being the center of attention, which is why this talk is called Holding Court with the Queen, because before we knew that Scott was laying on the floor with peas on his eyes, I imagined it as Ellen is sitting in a throne and they're on their knees in front of her, just eating up every little scrap of story there she's telling them. And it's impossible to read y'all's interview without seeing how much fun everyone is having. I think I wrote in the introduction that the only thing wrong with that interview is that you will be filled with jealousy that you were not there experiencing all of that.
And it was in her house, and her apartment got hit by Katrina, so she was always critical that she didn't have all of the books she needed there. But I remember the Drunk with Love dust jacket, the artwork for that was hanging on the wall.
Yeah.
Right where we were doing the interview, and it was very large, but she had the cover art for Drunk with Love.
Yeah,
and I'm sure she had a lot more of the art, but that was displayed in her house in Ocean.
And that's that Jenny Crouch Stanford from Fayetteville. Holly, was there anything surprising in your talk were you like, oh, or did you learn anything new about her?
No, John Evans and I made a little bet. He dared me to use the quote from her book about using the F word about the Country Club of Jackson, and I did it against my better judgment. But she loved it, and we walked out of it. She gave me a big hug, and she said, "I'm proud of you." So that was kind of nice. No, I mean, I was just really happy to get through it in an hour, that she was happy. It seemed to be cohesive. It was a packed house. I mean, it was standing room only in there. She could really draw a crowd.
That I'm not going to read that line. It's not appropriate for History is Lunch. But Holly reads it, and Ellen says she cleaned it up. So apparently you still said one F word, but maybe, I don't know, I can't.
Double down.
But she knew it immediately. She was like, wait, this is not my work. You have adapted it. But yeah, they both sound like they read so easily. For us who, had the disadvantage of not being there for either interview, but luckily the reader, the experience comes out very clearly in both of these interviews.
One thing that she would do is she would write letters. She wrote us many letters. And she would, I remember one letter she sent to Scott that literally was typed, and then she had put a pasted correction over that. And there was just all these, it was cut and paste. And we kind of joked, Eudora kind of did something similar with some of her stuff. But she very much, when she would write you a letter, you would have the bottom line with something pasted over it with new. Scott,
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly right. She would have had like 3 pages of stuff, and she took scissors and stuck it in different orders. And then she stuck new stuff that might be handwritten on top of that.
and that was the letter you'd get. It
And
would
that
be
was your
pasted
letter.
together.
I mean, why start over? This is just a time-saving activity.
Oh, no, I have notes from her on receipts. I mean, like on the back of the, Piggly Wiggly receipt. So I have a question that I've always been curious. I ask everyone this. What's your favorite Ellen Gilchrist body of work?
Are you?
I think her first collection of short stories.
I would have to agree, because you feel connected to the poetry. It's such a lyric book. It's pristine use of language.
Very much dreamy dreams.
Yeah.
Very much. Yeah. I totally agree. Tracy, you?
I recommend people start with In the Land of Dreamy Dreams, just because I do think it is the most lyrical. And it's an introduction to all the characters you're going to get to know throughout the years. But the collection, the 2 books that I reread Victory Over Japan, and I love The Annunciation, the novel that she complains a lot about having to write. But they're all good.
That's the order. That's my order too. I mean, but in the cult era of Ellen, asking someone which their favorite book is, most people will say Victory Over Japan. But hands down, Land of Dream Dreams.
What was her joke about Annunciation, that all the religious bookstores were ordering thousands of copies?
Yes.
And Little and Brown had to say, you want to look at this book before you order it. One thing I do think is important is she really loved her house in Fayetteville, and you've been there, but it was designed by one of the acolytes of Frank Lloyd Wright, E. Fay Jones, and she said that he had a great sense of how to place a structure, and he's very influential in Fayetteville and very prominent at the architecture school. But she had been looking for one of his houses, and she found one, and she said the entire eastern wall and the western wall are all glass, and she said in the interior was California redwood.
I have to ask you a question though, because how the hell did she have a creek in her living room?
Well, when Luke was generous when he said I've been there, I drove by as a weird pseudo stalker a few years ago. So I am not sure how the creek ran through it, but the creek is mentioned in lots of interviews. So if anyone, there's probably some architecture.
She said a creek ran through it.
Well,
A creek ran
yeah.
through her living room. I don't know if it came out of a spring or a pipe or natural groundwater, but a creek ran through her living room.
a river runs through it. A creek runs through. I don't know. We have to wrap up, and I'm going to hand it over to Drew, who's going to handle any questions.
Yeah, we've got plenty of time for Q&A, so if you'll raise your hand, I'll make my way around the room.
I should probably know this, but I don't. Where are her papers? And part 2, what are y'all going to do with the Gilchrist-related papers that you have in your possession?
Well, I have a significant number of her papers, and when she died, I talked to her son, Pierre, he said, well, you make me an offer. And I was like, I don't think I can beat the University of Arkansas. So to my knowledge, the University of Arkansas has the bulk of her papers. I have several manuscripts with notes. I don't know yet. If I die, there's a note on my bookshelf with 5 books that say, get these to Ellen Daniels immediately. Do not proceed past Ellen. So
I'm sure the Department of Archives and History.
We'd love to have them. Happy to.
Could take care of those very well, don't you think, Ann?
The time that she comes into Northwest Arkansas is the time that they were also hosting a lot of counterculture. And you mentioned the architecture and all that, but that place, Northwest Arkansas, had a lot of intentional communities and hippies and whatnot. And I'm wondering if that was ever reflected in anything she did.
Yeah, I think there's lots of stories. Several. Well, the Annunciation part of that is set in Fayetteville, and it gets kind of hippy dippy. She's going to a healing man, and she goes to Eureka Springs, and I don't know. There's some hippies, present in that, but also, she's very into the intersection of science and spirituality. And so, one of those books is called Light Can Be Both Wave and Particle. And which she says in some interview, like, I can't believe they let me name it that, But yeah, I think that counterculture.
It was interesting, though. She said she wanted her students to study geography and geology and not classical works. It was more in the light of, she very much wanted her students aware of things, and she wasn't sure they wore.
It was I gathered from that she wanted them to have a sense of place and time. But also, when I met her early on in the 80s, she was a very progressive person. A very progressive woman. To do what she did and sort of go counterculture against the Country Club of Jackson and the women here and that kind of cultish, hierarchy BS. She really stood up to people. And but did it in the nicest, kindest way humanly possible. So when she walked away, you weren't quite sure if she insulted you or complimented you. But she really was a progressive, open-minded woman, human being.
I think to be able, some of the stories that are set in New Orleans, especially, they really skewer that rich New Orleans life. And she talks about in a later interview that, she gets out of that world. And makes fun of it and runs around with her hippie friends. But then every once in a while, she has to make sure she can still get in.
She also was very much into self-awareness. She had Freudian therapy. She had Jungian therapy. She spent a lot of time with psychiatrists trying to figure out what had happened in her life. She was very anti-substance abuse. She was anti-drugs. She was anti-alcohol. And those were just personal things I knew about her. I don't know that she made those things public, but she fell down the steps and fractured her skull, for God's sake. And then she had to go on a sailboat to live, which was like running away from New Orleans. So she went away to live on a sailboat, and they told her she had to wear a football helmet.
Now that story sounds insane. I know you're thinking, what is he talking about? But all of it is true. And she does refer to it in several of the interviews that her drinking got to the point where she fell down the stairs and then she stopped drinking because of this. And she said she wore the helmet for like a day. Yeah. And then
that's what she told me.
Yeah.
It's interesting that she felt like that if she stayed in New Orleans, though, she would never have been able to quit drinking. She said it was so ingrained in the culture there, and that she had to physically leave New Orleans to overcome alcoholism.
And I think she discovered in herself a predilection for addiction.
We've got one more question.
Mr. Lampton, all right, good. You mentioned that when she wrote short stories, very often it was her poetry in the text.
Correct. Okay. Correct. She would describe it hiding the poetry. So she wouldn't have the poems themselves. She would make the lyricism would be in the phrasing and the wording. Although when she initially started doing that, she would include in some of her early stuff, there are actual poems within them that are quoted by characters. But she said the trick is when you're writing, if you're a poet, if you write fiction, you've got to hide the poems in your work.
Well, years ago, when I was struggling with Light in August, by Faulkner, and Faulkner's a very difficult writer to read, someone explained to me, well, you have to understand he was a failed poet, so he's using his poetic forms in his prose and kind of stretching it out. So I was kind of intrigued by what you said that she did.
That's interesting. And Shelby Foote once told me, he said that every writer is a failed poet. He says, because it's a lot easier to write a bad poem than it is to write a bad novel. He said writing a bad novel actually takes a lot of work.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's give our incredible panel a round of applause again. We have copies of Conversations with Ellen Gilchrist for sale right over here just to the left of the stage. We'll also have our panel available. If you have any questions, comments, or want to get one of those books signed, they'll be here right at this table just to the left of the stage as well. Thank you guys so much for being here. Come back and join us again next week. We'll actually have our very own Jasmine Holmes that'll be with us and delivering her presentation, Lessons from Reading Mississippi's WPA Narratives. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And one more time for our great panel today.
You and I were both there. We had a time of Tracy, can you take this over?